Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here. Yes, I know the annual Institute of Irreverence just released its latest irreverent rankings, and once again, we are at the top. It was us and Peter Mansbridge's podcast that were in the running, but we ended up coming out on top. This is the Andrew Lawton Show. As mentioned, good to have you aboard on True North, whether you're listening to the podcast, watching on YouTube, on Rumble. I was going to say on Facebook. We're still, because of the whole online news act, effectively banned from having our content seen on Facebook. So I think we have like one guy in Eswatini who is seeing it, but anyone in Canada isn't. So we still try. You never know. But I do want to begin, and I'm going to be talking about a whole bunch of different things today. We'll be touching base later on in the show with Paige MacPherson about what's going on in your kids' classrooms. We'll also talk about what's happening in your city council a little bit with Lynn McDonald, a former New Democrat member of Parliament and history professor who has been one of the most vocal in speaking out against the unfair maligning of Henry Dundas. Henry Dundas, who has had his name purged from Yonge-Dundas Square in Toronto. There was a bit of an update on that story this week that we'll talk about. But I also want to talk, most importantly to me anyway, for the course of today's episode, about this story in British Columbia that touches on a discussion we had last week about MAID, or medical assistance in dying, or assisted suicide, or euthanasia. It has lots of names, lots of nicknames. I don't like MAID because it is a bit of a euphemism, but sometimes I slip into it as a bit of a shorthand. But know that I believe very much there is a culture of death in this country. I'm coming right out of the gate with it because we have seen in Canada the expansion of so-called MAID from something that was meant to be so narrow, focused on a specific type of person that had a foreseeable death that was in excruciating pain and discomfort, where we know that they're going to die on their own and we can allow them to die earlier. That was the initial case, people with severe degenerative diseases. And as soon as that happened, as soon as that was legalized in Canada after the Carter case, we started to see the eligibility criteria broaden further and further until now we have a plan afoot to expand access to assisted dying to people that have only a mental illness. There is nothing physically wrong with them, but they will still be eligible. And for me, I've shared my own experiences as a survivor of depression and suicide, someone who I'm convinced would have made an effort to avail myself of state-sanctioned, state-assisted death had it been available to me back in 2010 when I was going through the very worst of my struggles. But there are other aspects of this case that, in this story, this issue, that are not just about who's eligible. It's about who has to do it, who has to facilitate this life-ending, I can't even call it a treatment because it's not a treatment, this life-ending procedure. Even the most, I shouldn't say even the most, but many of the most ardent activists for assisted suicide do not go so far as to say that every single doctor should have to do it. There has been in the system a level of tolerance, if not respect, for conscience rights, for doctors who say, because of my conscientious beliefs, my religious beliefs, or my beliefs of what my job is as a doctor, I am not comfortable partaking in this. And you also have institutions that are like that, in particular Catholic institutions that still have, in some key respects, a respect for life baked into their approach to healthcare. The reason I'm talking about this now is because there's a case in British Columbia where Providence Health has had to transfer 9 patients due to its opposition to assisted dying. 19 patients. They've had to transfer 19 patients to other facilities that will do this, that will go it. This is because they were in St. Paul's Hospital, which is a run, well, there's actually been different ones. St. Paul's Hospital, Mount St. Joseph Hospital, Mays Place Hospice, and St. John's Hospice. This is a network of healthcare facilities that are run by a Catholic organization, which does not believe in offering assisted suicide. So now the government is getting all concerned about this. The BC government has actually encouraged a lawsuit that's being filed against the family of one patient, against a physician as well, suing the hospital for saying they violated the patient's charter right. The hospital discriminated against the patient, violated her constitutional rights, the family says, by not killing her. Now, this was a 34-year-old woman dealing with terminal cancer. My heart breaks for her and for her family. I am not at all commenting on her case and whether she should have or should not have been eligible for MAID. What I am talking about here is this family's belief that that hospital that she was in had an obligation to facilitate this, that an organization that was not comfortable with this, doctors, nurses that were not comfortable with this, that they should have to do this. No one denied her the right to end her life. To the contrary, she was transferred out, brought to a facility that would offer this. Her name is Samantha O'Neill. She died from assisted suicide in April of 2023. It was a 12-kilometer ambulance ride. Part of the issue that's being raised by her family is that she was in such pain and discomfort. She had to be sedated for the ride. It's not the most comfortable situation. I get it. You don't want to go on a road trip when you're in such a terrible state in your health. But at the end of the day, we're talking about something very fundamental here. And I believe wholeheartedly that it is not a violation of your rights to not end your life, but it would be a violation of the hospital's rights and the rights of its staff and practitioners to force them to work against what they believe, to force them to do something they are clearly not comfortable with. And by the way, I've talked about this with so many different practitioners, and they all say, the ones who are critical of this regime, critical of this system, that there is no earthly way that you can call assisted suicide healthcare. Healthcare is about improving the life and health of patients. It's about, when possible, lengthening their life. And the reason palliative care has emerged as a discipline is because we realize that when you cannot extend that, you provide comfort, you provide care, you often hear the euphemism making them comfortable. That is very different from prematurely ending it, which is why there are some people that have a philosophical, moral, or religious objection to this. Now, one obvious criticism that comes up of this as well, it's a public healthcare system, so all hospitals, all doctors should have to go along with this. The problem with that argument, first and foremost, is that the public healthcare system does not trump your religious and conscientious rights as a doctor. It doesn't deal with the fact that you still, as an individual, have a right. No one can force you to do this. And people say, oh, well, maybe you just shouldn't be a doctor. Well, the reality is, in our public healthcare system, a Catholic hospital doesn't have the right to say, we are going to be a Catholic hospital that operates outside the public healthcare system. If we were to talk about a situation in which we are going to allow that, then maybe we could talk about whether the public system should have to go with a certain approach to this and alternative religious-run facilities don't. But that's not where we are now. And British Columbia has always been, when it comes to assisted suicide, one of the most, in fact, I would say the most permissive regimes for it in the country. In British Columbia, people who were never eligible or wouldn't be eligible in other provinces for MAID, as it's called, would actually be able to find doctors willing to sign off on this and ultimately end patients' lives, even before the criteria expanded to as broad criteria as they have now. So this does rile me up, because the whole point of this is that we have given up on people. We have given up on the idea that life can improve. I am particularly riled about the mental illness expansion, which I realize is not the one at issue in this particular case. But I'm also very frustrated by those who seek to deny conscience rights, those who seek to say that your strongly held moral beliefs about the value of life, beliefs that in many cases are why Catholic charities are running hospitals in the first place, because they want to, and I'm not Catholic, but they want to make people's lives better. They want to help. They want to contribute. And then you get people like David Eby, the premier, basically, and the patients who are suing, the lawyers who are taking up this case, the activists at the so-called Dying with Dignity organization, saying that, no, you should have to do this. You actually don't have a right to value life. That's what these people are saying when they're ultimately taking lawsuits against Catholic charities for not killing their patients. You think of how many millions of dollars are spent on malpractice lawsuits of doctors who make a mistake that ends up harming a patient, or in terrible cases, killing a patient. Now we have a lawsuit led by people who are concerned that doctors didn't kill a patient, that they said, we actually do not offer this. And this wasn't the case of someone picking out this woman and saying, we are not going to provide this. This is a case of a hospital saying, we simply don't offer this. So the BC government has gone so far as to build a facility next door to it, basically. They're trying to build an alternative so that instead of taking the 12-kilometer ambulance ride to another hospice, you can just go next door and get your end-of-life care there. Now, this is not the first time this has happened in BC. There's a story that True North has covered in the past with the Delta Hospice, which is, again, a facility that does not offer MAID. They have an incredible focus on palliative care. They were ultimately evicted from a building they had a long-time lease with the hospital over because the hospital wanted to get rid of them to take over care because they wanted to offer assisted suicide. It was so important that they were going to evict the kind charitable hospice organizers, and they did. They kicked them all out. Angelina Ireland, who was the head of the society and still is the head of the Hospice Society, has spoken out about this. And her view is that MAID is not healthcare, that MAID is not, in fact, a treatment, and it is something that is a slap in the face to palliative care, which is a discipline that has, I think it's about a 5 or 6 decade long history in medicine. And again, I am not trying to convince anyone for or against assisted suicide more broadly. I'm trying to talk here about if we are going to have this as legal in Canada, which is not changing right now, at the very least, we have to expect and respect that there are people that are not going to want to do this. And in a free society, we respect those rights. You as a patient have the right to go elsewhere. No one has denied any patients in British Columbia's right to seek this elsewhere if they are eligible. But to force a doctor to pick up a needle, to force a hospital to force a doctor to do that is absolutely disgraceful. And by the way, CBC's story about this, the headline, Providence Health reveals 19 patients were forced to transfer this year due to its MAID policy. Nowhere in this article do they explain why the healthcare center, why St. Paul's Hospital is not offering this. Nowhere do they speak about conscience rights. In fact, the word conscience doesn't appear in the story. Nowhere in the article do they talk to anyone about why conscience rights matter. They could have picked up the phone and spoken to Nicole Scheidel of Physicians for Life. They could have spoken to a constitutional scholar. They could have spoken to a bioethicist. They could have spoken to anyone. They could have spoken to me. Hell, if it's a slow day, I would answer the phone and do this. But they have not talked about what actually is at stake here. Instead, they quote activists that are saying this is absurd. They quote a professor who worked with that so-called Dying with Dignity Canada group, just crapping all over the hospital for protecting and defending conscience rights. So CBC is effectively here pushing this idea that doctors and hospitals should be forced to offer assisted suicide on command, even if they have long-standing moral objections and in many cases medical objections to doing so. But absolutely disgraceful all around. I wanted to pivot from British Columbia to Toronto here. So if you've been following this saga, Yonge-Dundas Square is the weird Canadian imitation of Times Square. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot less happening. But now you can't call it Yonge-Dundas Square. The city is renaming it to quote unquote Sankofa Square. And as True North talked about in the past, the word Sankofa has its own little sordid history that we'll talk about in just a couple of moments. This week, the executive committee of Toronto City Council got together and they are basically trying to figure out how much money this is going to cost. And they think they need more money to do it, to change the signs and update all of this stuff. But it's all based on a premise that is just fundamentally wrong. The premise that Henry Dundas is a figure in history worthy of cancellation. And anyone familiar with his history, with Canada's history, with the UK's history, would know that this is absolutely not the case. But clearly there are people that don't understand that. So we thought we'd give a bit of a history lesson here on the show. It's our delight to welcome back Lynn McDonald, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Guelph and also a former member of Parliament and someone who is not prepared to accept the unfair maligning of Henry Dundas and his legacy here. Lynn, good to talk to you again. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Glad to be with you for the show.
So obviously, there's from a municipal taxpayer perspective, lots that can be discussed about this, just in terms of how much the city of Toronto is trying to spend on this. But when it comes down to it, the issue that I have, and the one that you've raised in a rather lovely piece in the National Post this week, is that we're doing this all based on this faulty premise, this idea that Dundas is this figure from which we should be running as far as historic legacy is concerned. And let me just begin by asking you right there, for people that haven't familiarized themselves with this issue as much, why is Dundas being so unfairly, in your view, maligned?
It's hard to understand why it's happening because it's so obviously wrong to blame him. Now, what happened is it came up in Edinburgh because Henry Dundas was from Edinburgh, and there's a Melville statue and so on. And the Edinburgh City Council went after him, and plenty of Scottish historians said how wrong they were. So this was contested in Edinburgh before it happened here. And then here, and how Olivia Chow, who herself was a member of Parliament, how she could get it wrong is just nuts. The supposed delaying of the abolition of slavery that Dundas is accused of was never a law that he got delayed. It was only a motion, which is an opinion. And the abolition of slavery at the time that Wilberforce had, he had introduced it in 1791, then 1792, Dundas was there, and he moved an amendment to make it gradual. Well, it hadn't passed, it didn't come close to passing when it was full abolition, immediate, the year before. It didn't have a hope of getting through the House of Lords. It wasn't a bill. It wouldn't become a law. It was only an opinion. So he didn't delay anything. And he was a committed abolitionist. Even before that, he had gotten slavery abolished in Scotland by taking a law case on appeal. It went to the law lords, and the law lords decided there could be no slavery in Scotland, thanks to his arguments. So he already had a very strong reputation for being pro-abolition.
Yeah, and it's so easy to find too. We're not talking about a legacy that has been all that obscured. And Simcoe is another example of someone who was an abolitionist, and he's criticized in some parts because he took an incremental view, which he did because he was so committed to abolition. He wanted it to work. And in Dundas's case, that even doesn't really apply here, because he did move ahead, as you note, in Scotland. And I'm left with the hypothesis here that he is guilty of just being alive in history, and that no one is really able to emerge from that period.
Yeah. Well, Dundas understood that it would take time, and that there'd have to be negotiations, and you'd have to buy off the slave owners in the West Indies, the plantation owners. He understood that. He was more realistic. But even he did not have any idea how long it would take. And people are disgusted when eventually slavery was abolished, and the legislation finally passed in 1833 to apply in 1834. And this supposed delay of Dundas's, this is 1792. So it's years since that it's coming forward again. And it's just, Dundas just didn't know how long it would take. And even when the bill went through in 1834, it didn't get applied properly because slave owners, they could keep buying slaves because you could make money in the slave trade, and people did. So you have a law that finally said, that one was passed in 1807, that the slave trade was abolished by the British Parliament. Well, it isn't abolished if slave traders are out there and no one can catch them. The Atlantic Ocean is a very large ocean.
So let me ask you about the attitude behind this, because it should be noted, you were, when you served in Parliament, a New Democrat. You've been committed your entire career to the principles of social justice. So you're not coming at this from a place that some people might inherently accuse critics of this historic revisionism from, and that you're not sensitive to racial concerns, you're not sensitive to social justice. But many of the people who are committed to this idea of purging Dundas's name believe they are doing so because they're trying to be anti-racist. And what is it they're getting wrong?
Well, I agree with you. They think they're doing the right thing. And of course, there is racism, no doubt about it. But Black people, Indigenous people are discriminated against, no doubt about that. But what people like Dundas and Wilberforce were trying to do was right, but was going to take a very long time. And the idea of using the Sankofa Square, because it's a Ghanaian term, so it's African, so somehow that makes it more virtuous. But if you look at Ghana, the new name for the old Gold Coast, it was a slave society. Well, slaves were all over Africa and in most of the world for that matter. They were there. But Ghana had a particularly horrible version of slavery in which the slaves of a chief who died would be beheaded so that they could serve him in the afterlife. So Ghana's even worse. So here we in Ontario, or our ancestors, got, thanks to Simcoe, got a bill through in 1793, gradual, but it started. And here, the material I have turned up shows how horrible the practice of slavery is in Ghana, and that's in 1847, after slavery had been abolished in the British Empire, but it's still going strong in Ghana.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that history, and we had reported on that a while ago, the origins of the word Sankofa, which they're trying to rename Yonge-Dundas Square to, and the meaning of it is learning from the past, which is delightfully ironic for people committed to erasing history, but that's neither here nor there. What people often forget about slavery, and this is by no means to both sides it or talk about one group being better than another, but it was fueled not just by white colonialists. There were people in Africa that were selling other people from Africa into the Atlantic slave trade. And you are right to point out that in Ghana, this particular pocket, that was a particularly insidious practice. Slaves that were being shipped across the Atlantic and slaves that were being used and traded within Africa.
Yes, indeed. I mean, slavery was there. The slave traders who came in to the ports in Ghana and other places, they didn't have to go out looking for slaves. They were brought right to the port by slave traders. And some of the people would already have been slaves, so they weren't just enslaved at that point. Some of them would have been, but some of them were simply kidnapped. And they were brought to the port and sold. It was a commerce, and Ghanaian leaders made money from the slave trade at the expense of ordinary Ghanaians or slave Ghanaians, but people who were free, who were then kidnapped and sold into slavery.
So to bring this back to the Toronto context, I mean, when I started learning about the origins of the word Sankofa and the tribe that had minted that word, there was a part, I had some schadenfreude about it because I was expecting that, okay, all of these people that were pushing the erasure of the name Dundas would find that they now had to come up with another name. But as we've seen, they just disregard these concerns and move on. I mean, ideally, we'd get to the point where as a society, we could take a step back and have an honest discussion about history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and talk about how we learn from it. And I'm wondering, within the field of history, you were a professor for quite some time at the University of Guelph. How are historians dealing with this? Because any that I've spoken to have really just been shaking their heads because they feel they can't actually talk about history anymore in a way that is honoring and respecting the discipline of it and historiography.
Yeah, well, historians are some of them are causing the problem, but a lot of them just throw up their hands in despair. It's a very, very sad situation. And in the case of my own city councillors, Chris Boyce offered to give him a briefing. He didn't want a briefing, you see, and then tried to get a meeting set up in his college. Well, Innes College was quite happy to have a meeting about Dundas, but had to have the other side. Well, the other side wouldn't appear. They didn't want to debate with us. I think perhaps they understand that they've been putting out a lot of bullshit, and it would come out in a scholarly exchange, a panel at Innes College. So shall we say that the people who have been very forceful about it aren't willing to meet on a panel, don't want a briefing, and aren't willing to debate the issue.
So when you look at the way this is going here, obviously Jennifer Dundas, who's a descendant of Dundas himself, has been incredibly outspoken on this. And you have other people who are, but it's not even like you and Jennifer are losing the argument. As you know, no one even wants to have the discussion. City Council has had such little interest in genuinely interrogating the facts here. Have they? Or have I missed some grand dialogue that Olivia Chow presided over about this?
Well, it's just shameful. The expense is that what's gotten so many people riled up, and that's a legitimate concern. Also, the process. How many people were consulted about it? You know, and certainly we know that for the changing of the name of Dundas Street, merchants and all kinds of people would be inconvenienced. So City Council backed down on that. But the Yonge-Dundas Square, and the ironic thing is, Yonge really was a scoundrel. He actually did some good things in his life too. But later in life, he actually made money out of the slave trade. And so here we have Dundas gets attacked, and Yonge doesn't get attacked, although Dundas was solidly pro-abolition, and of course Yonge was not. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should rename Yonge Street, very long street it is too, because too much Ontario history has gone on it. But Yonge-Dundas Square is a terrible place. It's a lousy square. I'd like to see the money spent not on renaming it, but improving it.
Yeah, and this is where we go back to the cost of it. And you know, in some ways, government spending a few $100,000 here, a few $100,000 there, it seems like pocket change with what they spend on everything else. But you're right. I don't think anyone who walks around downtown Toronto would say that the most pressing concern is the name on the sign. It's the people on the streets, it's the drug issues, it's the, you know, the derelict buildings that you see in parts of that. And all of that is like lower on the priority list than, you know, maligning this historic figure.
Yes. Now, interestingly, Yonge-Dundas Square happens to be just a block away. That's east-west and a block north-south away from the old St. James's Square. The name no longer exists, but that's where Egerton Ryerson, when he bought for the government 6 acres of swampy ground, and that became the education department. There hadn't been one before, and the first normal school, which is Teachers College, teacher training college, and actually a museum, art museum, natural history museum, which later became the Royal Ontario Museum. And there was a lot of space actually for experimental agriculture to check out what crops were hardy enough. And that's basically the origin of the Ontario Agricultural College, for years, of course, now based at Guelph. And so here we have, I would like to see, because Egerton Ryerson is the other person, roughly at the same time people began to denounce Henry Dundas, were also denouncing Egerton Ryerson. And in both cases, they were dead wrong. Not just a question, partly wrong, partly right. They were dead wrong on it. Dundas was consistently pro-abolition, and Ryerson was consistently pro-Indigenous, nothing to do with the residential schools. So these are two subjects in which Toronto has got them both wrong. And ironically, Yonge-Dundas Square is only a block away from where Ryerson did some of his best work. I would like to see Yonge-Dundas Square renamed Ryerson Square. But it will take a while before that can happen, because people will have to realize that they really botched up the Ryerson decision.
Yeah, and put a big giant plaque up there explaining this whole thing to everyone. And you're right, because there are certain figures in history where you say, okay, this person may have done this great thing, but they also did this terrible thing, and you have to contextualize it. And I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to that. But in these cases, the people you mentioned are not even guilty of what they're accused of doing. So it's not even like they need to be contextualized. And look, anyone who's ever enjoyed a public education in Ontario should be tremendously grateful for what Ryerson did.
Indeed, but people don't realize it. We take it for, I didn't realize it until I just found it out relatively recently. We take it for granted that there's a public school system and that it's a good system. I mean, some people prefer to send their children to private schools and can afford it, but nobody's going to say you have to go to a private school because the public schools aren't good enough. Of course they're good enough. And that just didn't happen. In Ryerson's time, very few children went to school at all. They were all fee paying. There was no teacher training. And he got those things going. When I say he got them going, he was a civil servant. He couldn't legislate them, but he could make recommendations, and he managed to persuade enough people to support him. Interestingly, one of the people who certainly was persuaded, was very helpful, was John A. MacDonald. At that time, Mr. John A. MacDonald, not Sir John A. after Confederation. So he had to persuade people in the House of Assembly, MPPs that is, to support education. And Ontario became a leader, basically thanks to Ryerson's agitation, but they went along. It took legislators to actually do the work and get it done. And it happened.
Well, it is a fascinating piece. You touch on important parts of the history of Ghana, the history of Canada, the history of Scotland, and the insanity of Toronto City Council. So you've gone around the world in a way that only you can. Lynn McDonald, in your piece in the National Post, Toronto's costly push to trade Yonge-Dundas for a name more closely associated with slavery. Thank you so much, Lynn. Good to speak to you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again to coming on the show. Always a lovely conversation there. But I do want to turn to what's happening in your child's classroom. This has been an issue in which I think for far too long parents have been, I don't want to say complacent, but they've just been trusting. They've trusted the system that when your kids go to school, they're learning about the things they're supposed to be learning about. It's a reasonable assumption, but not exactly in 2024. We have heard so many stories, I would say some, in fact, rising to the threshold of horror stories about where parents have just been mortified to learn what their kids are learning, or perhaps not learning is a better way of putting it. Now, parents, when they learn about this, overwhelmingly reject it. This was a bit encouraging. It came out in a study done by the Fraser Institute last week on how parents do, in fact, want balance and not political bias when it comes to what's being taught in the K-12 classroom. 86% agree that there needs to be facts over opinions in Canadian classrooms. The overall support for parental notice of controversial topics, another key sticking point here, 81% believe in this. Some other numbers we'll dig into here with the study author, Paige MacPherson from the Fraser Institute. She is the Associate Director of Education Policy, and it's always good to have her on. Paige, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I mean, in some ways, it seems just blatantly obvious. When you put the question to a parent, do you want your kid to get facts in the classroom? Well, of course, they're going to say yes, but it's not obvious in practice, as we're seeing.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting, and it sort of speaks to two different things. One is whether teachers focus on facts or whether they share opinions or interpretations of their own of those facts in the classroom. And the other is the curriculum, which the provincial government does have quite a lot of input into, control over, and whether or not that focuses on specific facts that children should be learning, or so in other words, whether it's really content rich, or if it leaves it more open to teachers' interpretations. It gives kind of a vague overview, and then teachers can roll with it in whichever direction that they choose. So we gave the framing, that sometimes there is some debate over whether or not teachers should be sharing the facts or their interpretations of the facts, which can include their opinions. And as you said, 86% of parents with kids in K-12 schools with a representative sampling right across the country, so in every province and region, 86% of those parents believe that teachers and curriculum in K-12 schools should focus on providing students with facts rather than teachers' interpretations or opinions, and a learning environment within which students can openly explore those facts.
Were these pretty constant across the country?
They were, yeah. So we really found just with one, we can get into it later. It has to do with whether or not a child should be, or parents should be able to remove a child from a specific controversial lesson without impacting the child's grade. Parents in Quebec the majority did not feel that way. In literally every case, on every question that we asked in every province or region, parents were in complete consensus, not complete consensus, but overwhelming majority consensus that they should be involved and informed about what their children are learning, and that facts are really important and should trump opinions in classrooms and in informal school activities.
When we had last fall the discussion of quote unquote parental rights, it was typically from one side of the equation, and it was about one particular area predominantly. It was about a lot of gender and teachings related to sexuality. But the questions that you're asking are on their face content neutral here. When you're saying facts, not opinions, that could be someone who is like a really, really hardcore climate change alarmist that doesn't want an opinion critical of that, or it could be the opposite of that. So the whole point of this, as I would see it, is that when you put facts above a teacher's opinion, facts above a teacher's interpretation, it is non-discriminating.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think what is a controversial issue, and as you said, 81%, more than 4 and 5 parents with kids in K-12 schools believe that schools should provide advance notice of controversial topics being discussed in class or during formal school activities. What is a controversial issue is going to depend on the family. The different families are going to have different views on what a controversial is for their kids. And what we see here is that there is a clear consensus among parents that they want to be given a heads up so they can make their own decisions for their kids. And we explained, in sort of our preambles to these questions, we did this polling with Leger, a very reputable polling firm here in Canada, that, the controversial issues, just some examples, might involve sexuality or gender, might involve how we respond to climate change. But ultimately, you're right. I mean, it could be any sort of issue, and it really depends on the family. Some families might wish to discuss these issues with their children in advance. Other families might wish to remove their child from a lesson that they just don't feel is age appropriate. But ultimately, parents want to have that heads up.
So explain to me where policymakers should go with this, because we saw a little flurry of this in New Brunswick, in Saskatchewan, and Alberta. We certainly haven't seen it nationally. I think in Ontario, there's been a bit of ambiguity about where the province wants to go with this. But what would you take from this if you were to write the policy that government should be looking at?
Well, I think, when it comes to curriculum, this is a really important takeaway from these poll results, in my view, because parents so strongly feel, 86% feel that facts should be emphasized rather than teachers' opinions. That really speaks to how curriculum should be designed. And it should be including more facts, and it should be content rich, which gives teachers a very clear framework and guide to how they should be teaching these subjects. For example, we looked at most recently in a study that we released at the Fraser Institute at the history curricula in Manitoba, BC, and Ontario. In BC and Ontario, there were very few specific facts that children had to learn by the time they graduated grade 12. By the time they graduated high school, they had to almost know Canadian history. So if you were to change the curriculum, change those curriculum guides for teachers, make it a lot more specific about what exact facts, the people, the dates, the names, all of these different things that children should be learning in their curriculum, well, then it gives teachers a much more clear framework of what to teach, rather than just teach about genocide, and then they can kind of go in whichever direction that they like. Ultimately, that means that who the child's teacher is really matters because they can take it in so many different directions. So I think it speaks to curriculum. It also speaks to, I think, just the expectations around how teachers have to present the material. So more than 3/4 of parents, 76%, believe that children should be presented both sides of controversial issues, or they should be avoided entirely. If you can't present both sides, do not talk about controversial issues with our kids. 91% of parents believe classroom material and discussions should always be age appropriate. And as we talked about, that 81% of parents with kids in K-12 schools believe that schools should provide advance notice. So as you said, this has come up in Ontario, New Brunswick, where there's third-party groups that are presenting to kids. In New Brunswick recently, there was a discussion that was supposed to be about HPV, went in a totally different direction, addressing a bunch of different sexual behaviors. Parents were outraged. The premier spoke out. And so this is something that really could have been avoided if parents had just been given that advance notice. So if provincial governments, say to school boards, you need to give that advance notice, it has to be kind of baked in there, then individual schools or school boards will know that that's an expectation.
Now, this is getting into a trickier territory, and I'll give you the upfront warning that you can just sidestep the question if you'd like, because you're a policy analyst here and not a politician. But there's a challenge now in that the word fact has been weaponized in a lot of ways. And there are subjects that people that are putting what's clearly an opinion would just defend tooth and nail as fact. And I think you see this on some gender things where you have a certain group that says something is settled and it's not. So if we dig into this a little bit further, how do you account for that in this when you'll have curricula which are developed totally thinking or totally asserting things as facts that might not be?
Well, so we actually specifically got to that a little bit in our questions and how we frame them. We specifically said, controversial issues about which there is no clear societal consensus or consensus among experts. So there are some things where there is a societal consensus, right? And I mean, you could go down the rabbit hole, but we know that there are 2 + 2 = 4. And obviously, I know you can run with this, Andrew, but in general, we know that there are things that are established facts that children should be taught. Then there are things like the response to climate change, like sexuality and gender, where there might not be a societal consensus or a clear consensus among experts. And that is specifically what we asked parents about in this poll. In those instances, do you want advance notice? Parents said yes. Do you want to be able to remove your child from the classroom? And nationally speaking, as I mentioned, the only real outlier on this was parents in Quebec. But 7 in 10 parents believe that other parents should have the right to remove their child from a lesson without consequence to their child's grade if it is regarding a controversial issue. So parents there's a very clear majority here that believe that if there is no societal consensus on these controversial issues, give parents the ability to decide. Of course, what you're asking about gets to curriculum design as well. And ultimately, I think, what we're hearing from this poll, if I had to interpret, that parents are strongly valuing facts rather than interpretations or opinions in terms of what their children are going to be exposed to in lessons and in formal school activities. That to me sends the message that we should just focus on those clearly established facts and not wade into the political stuff in our formal curriculum and curriculum guides.
There you go. You took the tough question head on. So I appreciate that, Paige. Just before I let you go, I have to ask you about what's happened in Alberta here this week. We talked about this in the Ontario context, and you had said basically it was a good start, that they were doing some things that you liked and you wish they would do more. This is referring to getting cell phones out of the classroom. Alberta has come out now and said that cell phones from kindergarten to grade 12 will be out of the classroom, with narrow exceptions for students that have, particular health needs. Is this basically what you wanted in Ontario and Alberta now?
I think that the devil will be in the details as the provincial government moves forward with this policy. The policy seems to suggest that phones need to be out of sight and on silent or turned off. So how they enforce, will it be turned off? The issue that sometimes comes up with these policies, and this happened in Ontario, who years ago introduced a policy around this, and it just wasn't tough enough because it left it up to the individual schools or boards to decide. And ultimately, you had teachers who were having to surveil and nag their students all day. You had phones that were on silent and out of sight, but they were buzzing in kids' pockets. And we know that this creates a distraction not only for Johnny, but for Susie, who's then distracted by Johnny, who's reaching for his pocket. And it can take kids, according to some studies, a full 20 minutes to regain focus on an academic lesson after being distracted by a digital device. So I think the best kind of policy is something that is as blanket as possible, right across the board, with phones locked away for the school day. So whether you've got them in those yonder pouches, the lockable pouches, in kids' lockers, in some sort of special designated phone locker, I think that's the cleanest, simplest policy, with some exceptions, which actually, we had noted in our writing about this at the Fraser Institute and the Alberta government. I think the education minister specifically noted one reasonable exemption would be for a diabetic student who needs to monitor his blood sugar using an app on his phone. There are reasonable exemptions in there, but giving, every kid who asks for one, I just need to check my phone for such and such a reason, it's very distracting for that kid and the other kids in the class. And ultimately, the research shows it really does have a negative impact on academic outcomes, particularly math scores. So I think Alberta, like I said, the details will matter here. I think they have an opportunity to really be a leader on this issue by having a very clear and blanket ban, but we'll see where they go with it.
Well, and the problem of the enforcement problem is one, but it also, if teachers are the ones that really have to enforce this, creates the patchwork, just as with every other rule in school. Some teachers are more lenient than others. Some will turn a blind eye. I had some teachers where you could wear the hat in the classroom. Others, you could chew gum. So you're going to see that same dynamic here. And all of a sudden, as you mentioned, you're not even seeing this blanket ban in action.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, look, I don't think that at the Fraser Institute we are quick to say, oh, we need government to ban all of these different things. But ultimately, the research on this really is just so clear in terms of student academic outcomes, but also mental health. There's cyberbullying that goes on through the day at schools. It's extremely distracting for kids. It impacts their ability to socialize face to face. It impacts their ability to not be distracted, to actually focus in class. And academic achievement, student success, like this is what schools are for. So we do ban things in schools. And of course, this is government policy for government schools. There are already independent schools and charter schools in Alberta that are leading on this issue. They've already implemented their own policies to ban phones in the classroom, and they're doing so quite successfully. That doesn't mean that there needs to be sort of a ban on technology unless a school wants to go in that direction, because that's sort of the approach that they're offering. But you can still be innovative and leave room for kids learning about technology without that really deep digital distraction. And as you say, that patchwork approach where teachers are having to take so much time out of their day to nag and surveil, and then some teachers are not doing it because they've thrown up their hands and they've said, I can't enforce this if I'm not backed up by a clear government policy that I can say, look, it's out of my hands, it's not my decision. We don't bring drugs to school, we don't bring weapons to school, we don't bring our smartphones into the classroom, and that's just how it is. So I do think that in this case, there are certain things we ban at school, and smartphones should be one of them.
All right. Well, great stuff as always, Paige MacPherson. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
All right. That does it for us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show, doing a deep dive into the state of Canada's democracy. That's coming right up. Well, not right up. It's coming up in, almost 24 hours. But anyway, I hope you'll be there for that. Thank you. God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.